In the year 1266, a bard named Dandelion was tortured in a pigsty behind a Risberg brothel. The man who did it, a mage named Rience, wanted to know where Ciri of Cintra could be found, wanted it badly enough to use fire. Not spell fire, though Rience commanded such forces easily. Ordinary flame from an ordinary torch, applied to flesh with the patience of someone who understood that information extracted slowly was more reliable than information torn out in screaming panic. Dandelion told him nothing useful. This was not courage, though courage was required. It was calculation, the kind that comes from years of understanding that some secrets, once spoken, destroy more than just the person who speaks them, that some silences cost less than their breaking, even when the cost is measured in burned skin and shattered fingers. Yennefer of Vengerberg arrived before Rience could finish his work. The sorceress reduced half his face to scar tissue, which was justice of a sort, though not the kind that erases what had already happened. The bard survived, healed, mostly, continued traveling, performing, charming noble audiences with songs that made them laugh or weep or remember why they'd once believed in heroes. But the torture itself, the fact that it happened at all, raised a question that few thought to ask. Why would a mage sent by powers in Nilfgaard believe that a bard would know the location of the most sought-after child in the Northern Kingdoms? The wars between Nilfgaard and the Northern Kingdoms were fought twice, once with swords, fire, and the flesh of soldiers who fell in fields that bore their names for generations after, once with words, whispered in taverns, sung in manor halls, carried along trade routes by those whose trade was knowing what others did not. The second war moved slower, quieter. It killed fewer men outright, though it decided which armies would march and which crowns would survive the marching. Most never saw it happen. There was a man who understood this, Julian Alfred Pankratz, though the continent knew him by other names, Viscount de Lettenhove. If the title was genuine, his cousin Ferrand held the position of royal instigator in Carac, suggesting noble connections, though the exact extent of Dandelion's own standing remained a matter he neither confirmed nor denied with consistency. Dandelion, if you heard him sing. Jaskier, in the tongue his mother spoke when he was young enough to answer to it. He was a bard. That much everyone knew. What they knew less, what many never thought to ask, was what a bard does when he is not singing. The continent stretched from the Nilfgaardian south to the Dragon Mountains in the north, from the western seas to the Korath Desert in the east. Across this span, information moved in predictable channels. Merchants carried news of prices, soldiers spoke of troop movements, refugees brought stories of burned villages. These were the surface currents. Beneath them ran something else. Bards moved differently than merchants. They carried no goods that required protection, held no allegiances that could be easily traced, answered to no guild that demanded accounting. A bard could perform in a Temerian tavern one week and a Redanian manor the next, could share wine with a minor noble's wife on Thursday and dine with her husband's rival by 7-day, could hear a captain's boast in Vizima and by the month's end have woven it into a verse sung in Oxenfurt, 300 miles north. The songs people remembered, the conversations that preceded them, those they forgot. Dandelion had studied at Oxenfurt Academy for 4 years. The 7 liberal arts they called the curriculum: grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy, knowledge arranged in the old way, from the time when scholars still believed learning could be parceled into 7 pieces and no more. He passed his examinations with marks that surprised his instructors, had accepted a professorship that lasted less than a year before the academy walls began to feel like a better prison than most, and not different enough from imprisonment to justify staying. The roads called differently than lecture halls. What Oxenfurt had taught him, what the dormitories and debate chambers and long nights of wine-loosened argument had really shown, was how power worked when it wore words instead of armor, how a phrase repeated often enough became truth in the minds of those who heard it, how reputation could be built or demolished with the right verse in the right place, how information, properly placed, moved lords to action more surely than any thread of steel. The songs were what they paid him for, the listening that he gave away for free and profited from more than any performance fee. In the Northern Kingdoms, The oldest intelligence network was not Redanian, not Temerian, though Foltest spies numbered in the hundreds, not even Nilfgaardian, though the Empire's reach extended further than any northern service could match. The oldest network had no official name, no office in any capital, no salary drawn from royal treasuries. It was built of troubadours and tale singers, minstrels and balladeers, all the performers who followed the seasons from harvest feast to winter court and back again. They knew each other's circuits, recognized the territories each had carved over years of travel, shared news at crossroads, in backstage corners, over tables in the very taverns where they performed. A song learned in Maribor might reach Ardkarai within a fortnight, carried by someone who'd heard it and liked the melody enough to steal. Whether they thought of themselves as an intelligence network was another question entirely. Most did not. Most simply understood that news was currency in their trade, that fresh stories earned better coin than stale ones, that being first to sing of a scandal or a BF battle or a doomed romance meant filled houses instead of empty halls. Dandelion understood it differently. He had been recruited, though the word suggested a formality that had not existed in the arrangement. In the year 1266, Sigismund Dijkstra, who served as head of Redanian intelligence under King Vizimir II, had approached the bard with what might charitably be called a proposition. The conversation happened in Oxenfurt, the city where Dandelion still lectured occasionally, where Dijkstra maintained offices in the academy's upper floors. They called it the Faculty of Most Contemporary History, which was Dijkstra's joke. Dandelion called it the Faculty of Comparative Spying and Applied Sabotage, which was closer to accuracy and further from what anyone would say in official documents. What passed between them that day remains known only through its consequences. Based on what followed, the reports Dandelion would provide over subsequent years, the protection Dijkstra would extend when needed, one can infer the shape of their arrangement. The spymaster wanted information, the kind a bard heard naturally while traveling through courts and taverns. Who was gathering troops? Which nobles spoke of alliance? Which of betrayal? Where coin flowed freely and where it had run dry. In return, it appears Dijkstra offered what spymasters could offer: access, doors that might open more easily, friends who might appear in unexpected places when trouble arose, as trouble inevitably did for those who moved in complicated circles. No salary changed hands that could be traced, no oath was sworn that could be documented. Dijkstra was far too experienced to leave evidence of that kind, whether Dandelion accepted from patriotism or pragmatism or simple curiosity, whether he saw it as duty to Redania or merely advantageous positioning, remained a question without clear answer. What matters is that he did accept. The relationship that followed suggests he found the work more suited to his nature than many expected. What Dijkstra had recognized, what made the arrangement more valuable than any formal spy network, was that Dandelion already did the work, the listening, the watching, the gathering of scattered details into narratives that made sense. Every bard did. You could not perform successfully without understanding your audience, without knowing which stories would please a Temerian crowd versus a Redanian one, without sensing when a noble's marriage was fracturing, when a merchant's fortune had turned, when a garrison commander's loyalty had begun to waver. These were the foundations of successful performance. Read the room. Tell them what they wanted to hear, or what they needed to hear, or sometimes what they feared to hear. But tell them something that resonated with the reality they lived. To do that required intelligence, not espionage. Simple, practical, necessary intelligence about how the world currently stood. The difference between a bard and a spy was that the bard's questions seemed innocent, natural, part of the social fabric of performance and travel. Where are you from? What news from the capital? I heard the Duke took a new advisor. Do you know anything of him? The king's levy, is it really as large as they're saying? Conversations, the kind that happened every day, in every corner of every kingdom. Most led nowhere, yielded nothing but pleasantries and rumor. But enough of them, gathered across enough territory, over enough time, they formed patterns. Dandelion had always noticed patterns. Now he reported them. Songs moved differently than speech. A conversation happened once between two people or a small group. Its words dissolved into memory, changed shape with each retelling, until within days most could not reliably say what had actually been said versus what they thought they remembered. A song persisted. The melody anchored it. The rhyme made it easy to recall. Sing something 3 times and strangers would hum it walking home. Sing it a dozen times across a dozen towns and it would be playing in taverns you'd never visited, carried by people who'd never seen you perform. This made songs dangerous. Dandelion knew this in the way that anyone who works with powerful tools understands both their function and their potential for harm. You could shape perception with a ballad, could make a minor skirmish sound like an epic battle, could turn a mediocre lord into a hero into a cautionary tale, could suggest, never stating it directly, always through implication and artful phrasing, that someone was brave or cowardly, honorable or treacherous, worthy of trust or ripe for betrayal. The listener thought they reached these conclusions themselves. That was the art. His most famous composition, the one that spread further than any other, was called The Ballad of the Lion Cub of Cintra. It told the story of Cirilla Fiona Ellen Rhiannon, Ciri, as those close to her knew her, the girl whose grandmother had been Queen Calanthe, who had survived Cintra's fall, who carried blood from the old elven lines in her veins. Whether the song revealed accurate details or embellished them almost didn't matter. What mattered was that it established Ciri as a figure of importance, someone worthy of songs, someone whose fate would intersect with the fate of kingdoms. After that song spread, every intelligence service on the continent wanted to know where Ciri was. Dandelion had not intended that outcome, or perhaps he had. The line between artistic choice and political calculation blurred when your best friend was Geralt of Rivia, the witcher to whom Ciri's destiny was bound, and when your occasional employer was the head of Redanian intelligence. Songs built expectations. Once people expected something, once they could imagine it, sing about it, tell their children the story, it became more real than most actual events. The ballad of a lion cub princess became a truth that kings and emperors had to acknowledge, whether they wanted to or not. Information flowed in 3 directions simultaneously. First, upward. What Dandelion heard in taverns, manor houses, market squares, this he filtered and passed along to Dijkstra when their paths crossed, or through intermediaries when they did not. Troop movements, economic pressures, the personal weaknesses of minor nobles who might become important during wartime. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would mark him as a spy if discovered. Simply observation, delivered casually, the way one friend might mention interesting news to another. Second, outward. What the spymaster wanted known. What might serve broader interest to have spread could find its way into a bard's repertoire. How this worked remains a matter of inference. Dijkstra left no written instructions for song composition, but certain patterns emerged from studying which ballads spread when, which themes appeared at politically convenient moments. A verse suggesting Nilfgaardian commanders were overstretched, appearing just as northern kingdoms debated whether to press their advantage. A story about northern lords standing firm despite losses, sung when morale needed bolstering. Whether these arose from direct requests or from a bard's own sense of what was needed, what would serve the interests of those paying attention to him, the effect remained similar. The third direction was hardest to control. Between peers, bards talked to other bards, shared songs, gossip, complaints about cheap nobles and generous ones. This horizontal flow of information created its own network, independent of any spymaster's control. Dandelion participated in it naturally, but so did every other performer on the continent. Some worked for their own kingdom's intelligence services. Some simply collected information the way magpies collected shiny objects, because it was their nature and they couldn't help themselves. The network existed whether any single bard acknowledged it or not. It had existed long before Dijkstra recruited anyone, would continue existing long after. What made it valuable was not that any one person controlled it. What made it valuable was that it existed at all. This web of travelers, listeners, story carriers moving through every social class from peasant taverns to royal courts. Information entered the network at any point and could emerge anywhere else, transformed along the way, colored by each teller's interpretation but carrying threads of truth through all the embellishment. Armies marching left footprints in the earth, songs marching left footprints in the mind. Both moved nations. The northern kingdoms fractured along old lines. Temeria and Redania, the 2 largest powers, Aedern, Cadwin, Kovir and Povis, Lyria and Rivia, Verdun, Sidaris, Kerak. each with their own ruling houses, their own grudges, their own ambitions, each watching the others with the kind of suspicion that came from centuries of border wars and marriage alliances that failed to prevent them. Nilfgaard, in the south, was unified, the empire, singular in purpose when the northern kingdoms were plural in everything. This made intelligence gathering in the north simultaneously easier and more complicated. Easier because borders between northern kingdoms remained relatively porous. A bard with Redanian connections could perform in Temeria without much difficulty, could cross into Aedern, Kovir, even Cadwin if he knew which roads to take and which towns welcomed outsiders. The kingdoms competed but still traded, still married their children to each other's nobility, still shared enough cultural similarity that a performer could adapt his repertoire and find audiences. More complicated because loyalties shifted like river channels after spring flooding. A noble who supported one king this year might quietly fund his rival next year, if the political winds changed. Information that was accurate when gathered might be obsolete before it could be reported. The intelligence services themselves sometimes worked at cross purposes, with Redanian spies sabotaging Temerian operations, even though both kingdoms faced the same southern threat. Dijkstra navigated this by maintaining contacts across all the northern kingdoms. His network extended from Kovir in the northeast to Cintra in the southwest. Before Cintra fell, he recruited not just Redanians but anyone who could provide useful intelligence and could be trusted to do so, or at least trusted to behave predictably in their untrustworthiness. Dandelion fit that calculation perfectly. Not fully trustworthy, too fond of wine, too prone to boasting, too likely to get himself into trouble through sheer lack of caution, but predictable. Dijkstra knew the bard's weaknesses and knew that they would not lead him to betrayal. Dandelion's loyalty to Geralt was absolute. His loyalty to Redania was negotiable. His loyalty to his own reputation, to being known as someone who kept his word about certain things, that held firmer than most nobles' oaths. The spymaster used what held. Taverns and inns served functions that nobles who never entered them rarely understood. They were not simply places to drink and sleep. They were information exchanges, message centers, employment offices, courts of public opinion where reputations were built and destroyed over shared meals and ale. A merchant arriving from Maribor would spend his first evening in a new town at the local tavern, gathering prices, hearing about road conditions, learning which nobles were currently feuding and should not be approached at the same time. Soldiers did the same, mercenaries especially. They needed to know who was hiring, what the pay looked like, whether a captain honored his contracts or left his men unpaid when the fighting ended. Bards needed taverns for different reasons, but the pattern held. You could not perform successfully without understanding the current atmosphere, whether the town feared war or felt secure, whether the local lord was generous or stingy, whether audiences wanted heroic ballads or mournful dirges or bawdy drinking songs that let them forget their troubles. The innkeeper usually knew all of this, had to survive. Their establishment prospered or failed based on reading the social currents correctly. Offend the wrong patron and lose your license. Fail to provide good information to travelers and watch them take their business to your competitor. Smart innkeepers cultivated relationships with regular visitors, bards, merchants, soldiers on leave, the people who would return next season and remember whether they'd been treated well. Some kept mental ledgers of who owed whom favors, who could be trusted to settle debts, who might cause trouble and needed watching. In effect, they ran miniature intelligence operations from behind their bars. Dandelion recognized this early in his career, made a point of building relationships with innkeepers in cities he visited regularly. Small gestures, remembering their names, asking about their families, sometimes helping with small problems that his noble connections could resolve. In return, when he arrived in a town, the innkeeper would mention who else had passed through recently, what they'd said, whether anything unusual was happening. Not formal intelligence work, simply the normal courtesies of people who valued information and understood its worth. But those courtesies, repeated across dozens of taverns and dozens of towns, created a network that no spymaster could replicate through official channels alone. Geralt of Rivia complicated everything. The Witcher was Dandelion's closest friend, his most frequent traveling companion, the subject of more than half the bard's famous ballads. This relationship gave Dandelion access to certain kinds of information, about monsters, about the supernatural undercurrents that most intelligence services ignored, about Ciri, but it also made him a target. Anyone wanting to find Geralt would eventually come looking for Dandelion. Anyone wanting to manipulate Geralt might try using Dandelion as leverage. This had happened more than once. The worst incident involved a mage named Rience. In the year 1266, the same year Dijkstra recruited Dandelion, the bard found himself captured at a brothel and tortured in the pigsty behind it for information about Ciri's whereabouts. Accounts describe Rience and hired thugs using methods designed to inflict pain without permanent damage, at least not immediately. The mage worked for someone powerful. That much became clear through his questions and his means of escape. He believed Dandelion knew where the girl was being hidden. The bard did not. But that hardly mattered to someone determined to extract answers through suffering. Yennefer of Vengerberg arrived before the worst. Damage could be done. The sorceress engaged Rience in what records describe as a brief but intense magical confrontation. The mage fled through a portal opened by whoever employed him, but not before Yennefer's spell caught him, leaving a burn scar across his face that he would carry permanently. She retrieved Dandelion, treated his injuries, and explained in terms that left little room for misunderstanding that any further involvement in Ciri's affairs would likely result in worse outcomes next time. The warning was unnecessary. Dandelion had no desire to repeat the experience. What the incident revealed, what Dijkstra certainly noted when news reached him, was that multiple powers were actively hunting Ciri, that a bard known to associate with Geralt had become a valuable intelligence asset to all of them, that Dandelion's usefulness came paired with considerable risk. The spymaster's response was characteristically practical. He assigned additional watchers to keep track of Dandelion's movements, not obviously, not in ways that would make the bard feel imprisoned, simply enough oversight to know when someone else was taking interest, enough proximity to intervene if another capture seemed imminent. Protection and surveillance looked identical from certain angles. Geralt himself remained deliberately ignorant of most of Dandelion's intelligence work. The Witcher knew his friend reported to Dijkstra, suspected the arrangement involved more than casual favors, but Witchers maintain neutrality in political matters as a matter of survival. Getting entangled in the intelligence games between kingdoms was exactly the kind of involvement that could end with a contract on your head and no safe place left on the continent. Dandelion respected that boundary, rarely discussed his work with Dijkstra when traveling with Geralt, kept the two relationships separate as much as possible. This became harder as the wars intensified, as Ciri's importance grew, as more factions, northern kingdoms, Nilfgaard, the Lodge of Sorceresses, others whose allegiances remained unclear, moved pieces across the board in a game whose rules kept changing. Geralt would ask sometimes, after Dandelion returned from meetings with nobles or extended stays in capitals, what news there was. General questions, the kind any friend might ask. The bard answered carefully, shared what was public knowledge or close enough to it, omitted the rest. This was its own kind of loyalty. Keeping Geralt out of webs the Witcher wanted no part of, while still moving through them himself. The friendship held because both understood what the other needed. Geralt needed someone who could navigate court politics and noble sensibilities, who could talk their way out of situations where swords wouldn't help. Dandelion needed someone who could handle the violence that periodically erupted around them, who operated by a code simpler than the constantly shifting alliances of kingdoms. They balanced each other, made each other more effective than either would be alone. That Dandelion's effectiveness now included intelligence gathering for Redania. That was simply another layer in a relationship that had always been complicated. When Nilfgaard invaded the northern kingdoms a second time, the intelligence services of three powers collided. Redania's network, under Dijkstra, was most extensive in the north. Nilfgaard's military intelligence, led by Vattier de Rideau, was better funded and more ruthless. Kovir and Povis maintained their own service, smaller but surprisingly effective. The other northern kingdoms ran operations that ranged from competent to nearly non-existent. All of them wanted the same information: troop strengths, supply lines, alliance commitments, which nobles would fight and which would negotiate, where the Empire's forces would strike, and how the northern kingdoms would respond. Most critically, where Cirilla was. because every power recognized that controlling the girl meant controlling leverage that could reshape the entire conflict. Into this chaos moved bards, merchants, refugees, soldiers on leave, and all the ordinary people whose lives intersected with war, but who were not combatants themselves. Information flowed through them the way blood flows through veins, necessary for life, unnoticed until something ruptured, and suddenly everything depended on what had traveled where. Dandelion found himself pulled in multiple directions simultaneously. Dijkstra wanted reports on Nilfgaardian movements, on which northern lords were quietly negotiating with the Empire, on supply shortages that might force kingdoms to accept unfavorable terms. Other powers wanted to know what Dijkstra was planning. Some approached directly, some through intermediaries. Some simply followed the bard, watched who he spoke with, tried to infer connections from patterns of movement. Meanwhile, the normal work of being a bard continued. Performances had to be given. Audiences expected entertainment, not intelligence collection disguised as ballads. Innkeepers still needed paying. Instruments needed repair. The ordinary economics of traveling performance went on despite wars that were reshaping the political landscape. The strain showed in ways that Geralt noticed but rarely commented on. Dandelion drank more, slept less, became cautious about conversations in ways that seemed unlike him. The bard who had always been gregarious, who collected acquaintances the way others collected coins, now carefully sorted his social circles into those who could be trusted and those who must be kept at distance. The war was being fought on multiple levels simultaneously. Armies clashed at places like Brenna. Mages unleashed devastation at Thanedd, and beneath both, the intelligence services maneuvered, each trying to outmaneuver the others using information as their primary weapon. Songs that season took on different character, more somber, more focused on losses rather than glories. When Dandelion sang of battles, he emphasized not the heroism, but the cost. The peasants burned out of homes, the soldiers who would never return, the way war consumed everything it touched, and left destruction in patterns that would take generations to fully repair. Whether this represented his genuine feelings or bank-calculated messaging from Dijkstra remained unclear. Perhaps both. The best propaganda always contained elements of authentic emotion. No intelligence network is perfect. Information arrives late, gets distorted in transmission, misses crucial details because the person gathering it didn't recognize their importance, fails to reach the right decision-makers in time to matter. Every spymaster learns to work with incomplete data, to make decisions based on probabilities rather than certainties, to accept that some operations will fail not through anyone's fault, but because chance intervened. Dijkstra understood this better than most. His network had won him victories, prevented assassinations, identified traitors, positioned Redania favorably in diplomatic negotiations, but it also had limits that became painfully apparent during the war. The Thanedd coup was one such failure. Multiple intelligence services knew something was planned. Scattered reports suggested that certain mages were meeting secretly, that teleportation portals were being prepared, that Vilgefortz of Roggeveen, one of the most powerful mages on the continent, had alliances with forces whose identities remained concealed. What no one predicted was the scale of what unfolded. The attack on the magical conclave, the teleportation assault, the casualties among the most powerful mages of the age, the way the event fractured the Brotherhood of Sorcerers and led directly to formation of the Lodge of Sorceresses, an organization that would itself become a major power player. Dandelion had been on Thanedd that day, had seen some of what happened, survived largely through luck and Geralt's intervention. What he witnessed, what he could report to Dijkstra afterward, confirmed that all the intelligence services had failed equally. Nilfgaard's spies had not predicted it either, nor Kovrir's. The event represented a blind spot in everyone's information gathering, a demonstration that powerful mages operating in secret could still move faster than any mundane intelligence network could track. The lesson was sobering. There were other limits, structural ones. Bards could go many places, but not everywhere. Military camps had restricted access. Nilfgaardian territory became increasingly dangerous as the war progressed. Certain noble houses banned performers entirely, preferring silence to the risk of information leakage. The horizontal network between bards, the natural information sharing that Dandelion had leveraged, worked in both directions. What he learned from other performers, they could learn from him songs. He sang in one location would spread unpredictably. Sometimes this served his purposes. Sometimes it revealed things better kept hidden. Maintaining his cover as simply a bard, not a spy, required constant balancing. Performed too often at Redanian venues and people would suspect allegiance. Refuse such performances and lose access to information. Ask too many questions and mark yourself as suspicious. Ask too few and miss critical details. The work was exhausting in ways that combat never was. Combat ended. Either you survived or you didn't. But intelligence work stretched across months and years. A continuous low-level stress of maintaining false faces and remembering which information came from legitimate sources versus which must be concealed as coming through Dijkstra's network. Dandelion managed it through compartmentalization and drink, kept different parts of his life separate, drank enough to dull the stress, but not enough to compromise operational effectiveness, maintained friendships that had nothing to do with intelligence work, spaces where he could be simply himself, rather than an asset in someone's network. Geralt remained the most important of these spaces. With The Witcher, Dandelion could stop performing, could voice doubts, fears, frustrations without calculating how each word might be interpreted. The friendship was real, in ways that most of his court relationships were not. That realness sustained him through periods when everything else felt like theater. Information carries weight, not the physical weight of documents or messages, though those have heft. The weight of responsibility, of knowing things that must be acted upon, or deliberately not acted upon, or held in careful balance while waiting for the right moment. Dandelion knew things that could destroy noble houses, knew which lords were embezzling from royal treasuries, which knights had cowardice in their history, which advisors were selling information to Nilfgaard. Some of this he reported, some he held as leverage, some he simply carried, the knowledge changing how he interacted with people he might otherwise have liked. The bard who performed at a duke's wedding, singing romantic ballads about eternal love, knew that the duke's previous marriage had ended when he murdered his first wife. Knew this because the wife's brother had confessed it during a drunken evening in a Vizima tavern, believing he spoke to a simple entertainer who would never use the information. Dandelion had used it, quietly, not by revealing the murder directly, but by ensuring Dijkstra knew. The duke had subsequently been excluded from certain sensitive military planning councils, positioned where he could do less damage if his divided loyalties became active. The man never knew why his political fortunes shifted. These were the victories that left no monuments. The battles won by ensuring certain people never gained power to betray their kingdoms. The disasters prevented because someone noticed a pattern and reported it before it crystallized into action. Most of history's great betrayals could be traced back to intelligence failures, to information that existed but never reached the right people, to warnings dismissed as unreliable, to patterns that should have been obvious but were not recognized until too late. Prevention left no trace except in the things that did not happen. There were personal costs beyond the weight of knowledge. Dandelion's reputation as a womanizer, a drunk, a flamboyant personality incapable of taking anything seriously, this was partly genuine and partly constructed. The genuine parts gave the construction credibility. People who thought of him as frivolous were less likely to suspect him of serious intelligence work, but maintaining the mask meant losing pieces of himself, meant sometimes acting the fool when he wanted to show competence, meant accepting that people who might otherwise respect him would instead view him as an amusing curiosity, meant relationships that could have been deeper remained surface level because revealing too much of his actual nature risked revealing the intelligence work beneath. His friendship with Geralt survived because the Witcher saw through the performance, had known Dandelion long enough to recognize which parts were real and which were theater, and because Geralt himself maintained his own mask, the neutral Witcher, uninvolved in politics, caring only about coin and contracts, which allowed both men to understand each other's necessary deceptions. Most of Dandelion's other relationships were more complicated. The women he courted never knew the full extent of what he did. The nobles who patronized his performances thought him a talented entertainer and nothing more. Even other bards, his supposed peers, saw only the public persona. Dijkstra knew differently. The spymaster recognized the intelligence beneath the performance, but that relationship existed purely for professional reasons. They were not friends, would never be friends, used each other effectively but without the trust that true friendship required. The loneliness of intelligence work was not the loneliness of isolation. It was the loneliness of being surrounded by people while knowing that almost none of them saw you clearly. Ballads spread across kingdoms in patterns that intelligence services studied carefully. Consider one that emerged during a delicate period of alliance building between Redania and Aedirn. It told of an elven girl who betrayed her people for love of a human knight, how her family discovered this and exiled her, how she died of grief, calling his name, while he perished in distant battle, never knowing of her fate. The melody was plaintive, memorable. The words felt familiar enough to seem like an old story, specific enough to seem newly told. Whether this particular ballad came from Dandelion's pen remains unrecorded, but songs of this type, tales, that suggested division between races came from multiple sources, not solely human aggression, circulated when Aedirn's elven minorities became politically significant, when their cooperation was needed for the war effort. The timing invites interpretation. This was during a period when Redania and Aedirn negotiated alliance terms. Aedirn's population included substantial elven minorities, who had been treated poorly during previous conflicts. The Aedirnian king needed their cooperation, needed them to believe that fighting for the kingdom might earn them better treatment afterward. A song about an elf punished by her own people for loving a human. It could suggest that the division between races had multiple sources, that humans were not solely responsible for the long history of conflict. The message was never stated directly, but repeated in dozens of taverns, heard by thousands, sung by other bards who found the melody compelling. Such songs shape perceptions in ways that direct propaganda could not. Whether Dijkstra commissioned this kind of work, or whether it emerged from Bard's own reading of political currents, remains unclear. The spymaster left no paper trail. What can be observed is pattern. Certain themes appearing when politically useful, spreading through networks that included performers who had relationships with intelligence services. Other documented cases show the pattern more clearly. After Redanian forces won a minor skirmish near Anchor, barely more than a border clash, strategically insignificant in the larger war, ballads appeared that transformed it into heroic triumph. Named specific knights who had fought, described their courage in terms that, while exaggerated, were not completely divorced from truth, turned a footnote into a narrative that people remembered and repeated. The songs reached soldiers throughout the northern kingdoms within weeks. Morale improved measurably. Recruitment increased in Redania and neighboring regions. The knights named in the ballads found their status elevated, which strengthened their loyalty to the crown that benefited from the attention. This represents how narrative could be weaponized, not through lies exactly. The battle had occurred, those knights had fought, some courage had been demonstrated, but through reshaping proportion, altering context, transforming minor action into cultural event. The Nilfgaardian intelligence service recognized this pattern, began commissioning their own ballads through southern bards, paying for songs that emphasized the empire's discipline, its technological advantages, its inevitable victory, attempting to counter northern narratives with their own. The result was competing stories spreading simultaneously through taverns and manor halls. Neither side could fully control the narrative. Too many independent performers, too much organic information flow, but both could influence direction, make certain interpretations more likely than others. Where Dandelion fit in this musical warfare requires inference. His documented relationship with Dijkstra, combined with his prominence as a northern bard, suggests active participation. Whether he composed specific propaganda pieces, or simply allowed his existing work to serve strategic purposes, or some combination of both, the records do not make entirely clear. What can be confirmed is that he continued performing throughout the war years, that his songs spread widely, and that he maintained his intelligence relationship with Redanian services during this period. Years later, after the wars had ended, and new arrangements had been made, Dandelion would own a tavern. Not personally, not at first. The establishment had been left to him by a grateful patroness, and he had initially intended to sell it. But something about owning an inn, about controlling one of those information nodes he had used for years, appealed to him in ways he had not anticipated. He renamed it the Rosemary and Thyme, renovated it extensively, transformed it from a middling establishment into one of Novigrad's most successful entertainment venues, hired performers, managed bookings, played host in ways that satisfied both his theatrical instincts and his long-standing habit of gathering information. The inn became what he had always suspected the best taverns were, a hub, a place where information flowed naturally because people felt comfortable talking, where the innkeeper, now Dandelion himself, could listen without seeming to spy. could connect people who needed connecting, could learn things through ordinary conversation. Whether he still reported to anyone was a question that remained unanswered. Dijkstra had fallen from official power, though the spymaster survived and reappeared later running criminal operations in Nilfgaard. Whether the two men maintained any version of their old arrangement in this new context, whether the rosemary and thyme served intelligence functions or simply commercial ones, could only be inferred from how the establishment operated. It occupied a particular niche, not quite respectable enough for the highest nobility, not rough enough for the city's genuine criminal underclass, the middle space where merchants, minor nobles, successful criminals, and people whose occupations defied easy classification could gather without attracting undue attention. The kind of space where information naturally accumulated, whether anyone was deliberately collecting it or not. Geralt visited the tavern occasionally, found Dandelion's transition from traveling performer to businessman amusing and slightly bewildering. The Witcher had never understood money in the ways his friend did, never grasped the appeal of ownership, of putting down roots, of building something permanent. They would sit in the tavern's private rooms, away from the common area's noise, and share wine while catching up on months of separation. These conversations ranged widely. Monsters Geralt had fought, women Dandelion had courted, changes in political landscape that affected them both, the comfortable patter of old friends who knew each other well enough that silence between sentences felt natural rather than awkward. In these moments, the intelligence work receded. Dandelion was simply a friend again, not an asset, not a node in someone's network, simply the person who had traveled with Geralt through more adventures than either could easily count, who had been there during the bad times and the good, who would be there for whatever came next. That simplicity, that space where roles and calculations didn't matter, remained the most valuable thing either of them possessed. The networks that moved information through the northern kingdoms resembled no organizational chart. They had no headquarters, though Dijkstra's offices at Oxenfurt came closest, no official membership, though certain individuals were recognized as more connected than others, no chain of command, though hierarchies emerged naturally from who had access to what information and who could make decisions based on that access. What held these networks together was not structure, but incentive. People gathered information because information had value. Bards learned news because fresh stories earned better fees. Merchants tracked prices because their livelihoods depended on buying cheap and selling dear. Soldiers gossiped about their officers because knowing who was competent versus who was dangerously incompetent might save your life. The intelligence services, Redanian, Nilfgaardian, Ciri, the others, simply formalized what already existed, put names to nodes in the network, offered payment or protection or other incentives to people who would provide information more systematically, tried to impose order on organic systems that resisted organization. Dijkstra succeeded better than most because he recognized the organic nature of intelligence networks, did not try to control everything, instead identified key nodes, people like Dandelion who naturally occupied strategic positions and nurtured those relationships. Let the network operate largely on its own, intervening only when necessary to correct course or to exploit particular opportunities. This approach had limitations. When Dijkstra fell from official power, much of his network continued functioning without him. Some agents found new employers. Some simply kept doing what they had always done, gathering information out of habit or professional pride. The network proved more resilient than any single intelligence service because it had never fully depended on that service to begin with. Taverns, in particular, operated according to their own logic. An innkeeper's loyalty was to their establishment first, to customers second, to any external power a distant third. Dijkstra could not command what happened in a tavern's common room, could not prevent conversations he would have preferred to keep private, could not fully control which information flowed through establishments, even when he had relationships with their owners. What he could do was position himself to hear what was being said, place trusted individuals in the right taverns at the right times, ensure that information reaching his network arrived before his competitors learned of it, work with the grain of how taverns naturally operated rather than trying to reshape them into something they were not. Dandelion understood this instinctively, had never treated taverns as simply performance venues, always recognized them as social organisms with their own rules and hierarchies. The innkeeper was the queen bee, around whom everything else revolved. The regular customers formed the hive's body, each with their role. Travelers like himself were temporary additions, valuable for the external information they brought, but always slightly marginal to the establishment's core social structure. Success as a performer meant integrating into that structure smoothly, reading the room correctly, providing entertainment that enhanced rather than disrupted the tavern's natural atmosphere, making the innkeeper look good to their customers rather than overshadowing them. These same skills made intelligence gathering easier. The bard who had earned an innkeeper's trust would hear more than the spy who tried to extract information through payment or threat, would be told things without having to ask, would become part of the tavern's information processing system rather than an external observer. The wars ended eventually, not cleanly, not with treaties that resolved every dispute or borders that satisfied everyone. But the active combat phase concluded. Armies withdrew. Diplomats argued over maps. Life began approximating normalcy, though the scars, physical, economic, psychological, would remain visible for generations. Dandelion had survived. Many had not. The list of the dead included mages, soldiers, civilians, and several bards whose names Dandelion had known. People killed in combat, or by magic, or simply because they were in the wrong place when violence erupted. The war had consumed them the way wars consume everything, indiscriminately, wastefully, leaving holes in communities that could not easily be filled. The intelligence networks had survived as well, though transformed. Dijkstra's fall and eventual exile changed Redanian intelligence's character. Nilfgaard's service continued operating, but with different objectives now that the war had ended. Smaller kingdoms' networks contracted or dissolved entirely as funding dried up. The horizontal network of bards and merchants and travelers that persisted unchanged, had persisted through previous wars, would persist through future ones. Information continued flowing along trade routes and through tavern common rooms. Song still spread news faster than official proclamations. Gossip still shaped reputations and occasionally toppled careers. What changed was Dandelion's relationship to these networks. He no longer reported regularly to Dijkstra. The spymaster had other concerns, other operations. The formal arrangement had lapsed, though informal connections remained. They met occasionally, shared information when their interests aligned, but the employment relationship had ended. This should have felt like freedom. Instead, it felt like loss, not of the work itself. Dandelion had never loved intelligence gathering the way he loved performance, but of purpose, of being part of something larger than himself, of knowing that his observations, his careful listening, his songs, might influence events that shaped kingdoms. The Rosemary and Thyme provided purpose of a different kind, building a successful business, creating space where people could gather safely, contributing to Novigrad's cultural life in ways that didn't require lying about your motives. Simpler work, smaller in scope, but perhaps more honest. Geralt noticed the change, commented on it during one of their conversations at the tavern. "You seem lighter," the Witcher said. "Lighter? Less burdened. Like you're not carrying quite so much weight." Dandelion considered this, realized it was true. The constant vigilance of intelligence work, the careful sorting of what could be said versus what must be concealed, had receded. He still listened carefully, still noticed patterns in conversations, but didn't feel compelled to report them to anyone. Could simply let information be information, without calculating its strategic value. "The war's over," Dandelion said. "That changes things. Not for everyone. No, not for everyone." Geralt had his own complicated relationship with the war's aftermath. The Witcher's neutrality had been compromised by circumstances beyond his control. Choices he made protecting Ciri had marked him as partisan in ways that would affect how certain kingdoms treated him. Choices he hadn't made, allegiances he refused, had marked him equally. Both men had been changed by the war, by what it demanded of them, by what it revealed about themselves and the world they moved through. They did not discuss this directly, did not need to. The friendship held its own language, one where much could be understood without being spoken. If you wanted to understand power in the northern kingdoms, you could study treaties and noble lineages and military strength. This would give you one kind of understanding. Formal, official, the version of events that would be recorded in histories, or you could sit in taverns and listen to how people actually talked about their rulers, what they said when they thought no one important was paying attention, how soldiers spoke about their commanders, how merchants described their interactions with tax collectors, how peasants complained about the noble who owned their lands. This would give you different understanding, informal, unrecorded, but often more accurate than the official version because it reflected lived experience rather than political theater. Dandelion had always preferred the second kind of understanding, found it more interesting, more true, in ways that official documents rarely captured. The gap between how kingdoms presented themselves and how they actually functioned, that gap contained most of what mattered about politics. His intelligence work had formalized this preference, turned listening into profession, made systematic what had previously been casual observation, but the fundamental skill remained the same. Pay attention to what people say when they think their words don't matter. This was the lesson that intelligence services struggled to teach their agents. You could train someone to recognize codes, to follow targets without being noticed, to extract information through interrogation. But teaching someone to genuinely listen, to hear what was being said beneath the surface conversation, required different skills. Empathy, patience, the ability to make people comfortable enough that they spoke freely. Most spies could not do this, could imitate it perhaps, but not genuinely create the conditions where people revealed things they meant to keep hidden. Bards could. It was intrinsic to their profession. You could not perform successfully without understanding your audience at levels that went beyond superficial observation. Could not write songs that resonated unless you understood what actually moved people emotionally. Could not maintain a career without the social intelligence that made strangers want to talk to you, trust you, share their stories. This was why Dijkstra had valued Dandelion, not for any particular piece of intelligence the bard had gathered, but for the network of relationships, the accumulated trust, the sheer social capital that made information gathering possible without force or coercion. The architecture of intelligence was built on human connection. That was the secret that formal spy agencies struggled to replicate. They could create structures, protocols, hierarchies of information flow, could train agents and pay informants and establish dead drops and codes. But the most valuable intelligence always came from relationships, from people who shared information because they trusted the person asking, because they saw a benefit in cooperation, because they genuinely liked their contact and wanted to help. Dandelion had built such relationships across dozens of cities, with innkeepers, merchants, minor nobles, other performers, people who knew him as someone reliable, who had seen him keep confidences when asked, who understood that information shared with him would be used carefully, not exploited carelessly. This took years to build, could not be rushed, could not be faked convincingly over extended periods, and it was fragile. One betrayal, one careless revelation, and the entire network of trust could collapse. People would stop talking to you. Doors would close. The social capital would evaporate and could not easily be restored. Dandelion had protected this carefully throughout his intelligence career, had turned down opportunities that would have compromised his reputation, had refused to burn sources even when doing so would have provided immediate tactical advantage, understood that long-term value outweighed short-term gain. Dijkstra had understood this as well, had never pushed Dandelion to take actions that would destroy the bard's social position. The spymaster was ruthless, but not stupid, knew that certain assets were more valuable alive and operating than they would be if used destructively once. This was the difference between good intelligence work and bad. Bad work consumed its sources. Good work sustained them, created conditions where information could continue flowing year after year, building on previous successes rather than constantly rebuilding from nothing. 30 years after the wars, Dandelion's ballads were still being performed, not by Dandelion himself. The bard had aged, performed less frequently, preferred the comfortable authority of running the rosemary in time to the rigors of constant travel. But his songs had taken on their own life, been learned by younger performers, spread through the oral tradition that kept certain stories alive across generations. Some songs had become so common that people no longer knew who composed them, assumed they were folk ballads, passed down from time immemorial. This happened often with successful songs. The composer's identity dissolved into the collective memory. The song persisted as something that simply existed, like mountains or rivers, with no apparent human author. Other ballads retained attribution. People knew these were Dandelion's work, performed them as his compositions, sometimes adding notes about the historical events they described. These tended to be the more ambitious pieces, the songs about Ciri, about major battles, about figures whose fame had not faded. What struck Dandelion when he heard these performances, when younger bards sang his work back to him, usually unaware of his presence in the audience, was how the songs had changed. Small variations in lyrics, different melodies replacing his original compositions. Emphasis shifted, meaning subtly altered by generations of performers who brought their own interpretations. This was normal, expected. Songs were living things. They evolved through repeated performance, adapted to new contexts, served purposes their original composers never imagined. But it meant that his work, the careful balancing of artistic merit and political messaging, the subtle propaganda woven through seemingly innocent ballads, had taken on meanings he never intended. Some of his songs now supported positions he actively disagreed with. Others had been stripped of their original political context entirely, transformed into simple entertainment. He found this both frustrating and oddly satisfying. Frustrating because it revealed the limits of control. You could compose something with a specific intent, but once released into the world, it belonged to the world, would be used and misused and reinterpreted endlessly. Satisfying because it proved the songs worked, had achieved the cultural penetration that separated memorable art from disposable entertainment, would continue existing long after he was gone, even if they existed in forms he wouldn't entirely recognize. The intelligence work, by contrast, left no public trace. No one would sing ballads about gathering gossip in taverns, about carefully worded conversations that extracted useful information while revealing nothing important, about the slow accumulation of details that eventually formed actionable intelligence. This was as it should be. Good intelligence work remained invisible, succeeded precisely by not being noticed. The operations that made it into history books were usually the failures, the dramatic betrayals, the spectacular collapses, the moments when someone's cover was blown and everything came crashing down. Success looked like business as usual, like nothing happening, like kingdoms making decisions that seemed obvious in retrospect, but which had actually required careful intelligence gathering to enable. Dandelion had contributed to several such successes, had provided information that helped Redania position itself advantageously in negotiations, had identified threats before they materialized, had spread messages that shaped public opinion in favorable directions. None of this would be remembered, could not be, without compromising sources and methods that might still be useful. Even decades later, many specifics of his intelligence work remained secrets, known only to him, to Dijkstra, and to the small number of people who had been directly involved. This bothered him less than he expected. Fame as a bard provided sufficient recognition. The intelligence work had been necessary, had mattered in his time, but did not need to be celebrated publicly. Knowing he had contributed to his kingdom's survival during crisis, that was enough, and the work had taught him skills that remained valuable long after formal intelligence gathering ended. How to read people, how to find information others had tried to conceal, how to navigate complex social situations without making enemies unnecessarily. These skills served him well as a tavern owner, as a friend to those who needed someone capable of discretion, as someone who could be trusted with sensitive information, because he had proven over decades that he knew when to speak and when to remain silent. The history books would record the Second Northern War, primarily through its battles, Sodden Hill, Brenna, smaller engagements scattered across multiple kingdoms. They would note the Treaty of Cintra, the territorial changes, the dynastic marriages that reshaped political alliances. What they would not record, what historians rarely captured, were the things that did not happen, the invasions that were deterred because intelligence revealed them before they launched, the betrayals that were prevented because spies identified traitors early, the famine that was averted because someone noticed supply line problems and raised alarms in time to fix them. Prevention does not make compelling history, leaves no dramatic moments to describe, requires explaining counterfactuals that cannot be proven because the alternative never occurred. But the prevented disasters often mattered more than the recorded victories. Dandelion's contribution fell almost entirely into this category. He had not fought in battles, had not negotiated treaties. His name would not appear in most histories of the period, except perhaps in footnotes as a notable bard who composed popular ballads about the war. Yet his intelligence work had influenced dozens of decisions, had prevented mistakes that could have been catastrophic, had enabled strategies that would never be attributed to the intelligence that made them possible. This was the nature of intelligence work, necessary but unsung, effective precisely because it remained unnoticed. Decades after the wars, when both men were older, though Geralt aged slower due to Witcher mutations, they would sometimes discuss what the years had cost. In the Rosemary and Thyme's private quarters, over wine that Dandelion's younger self would have considered impossibly expensive, the question of regret arose. What those conversations contained precisely remains between the two men. But based on what Dandelion would later tell others, on how he spoke of his intelligence work in years after, certain themes emerged. The necessity of what had been done, the position he had occupied, and the uses to which it was put, the relief that came with no longer sorting every conversation into useful intelligence versus empty noise, the difference between creating art, even propagandistic art, and the pure negation of intelligence work, preventing, blocking, undermining. Necessary work, but work that built nothing visible. Whether Geralt pointed out that preventing disasters counted as creation, that keeping people alive was its own form of building, that seems likely, given the Witcher's nature. Whether Dandelion fully accepted that reassurance remains less certain. What can be confirmed is that the friendship held, that they continued meeting, continued sharing silence as comfortably as words, continued understanding each other in ways that required no explanation. The networks that moved information through the northern kingdoms continued operating long after the wars ended. Continue operating still. Bards travel between cities, carrying news and gossip along with their instruments. Merchants track prices and political developments, because their profits depend on staying informed. Soldiers gossip about their commanders, innkeepers listen to their customers, and all the ordinary people whose lives intersect with power continue sharing information through informal channels that no formal intelligence service can fully control. The intelligence agencies, those that survived the wars and the political changes that followed, still try to systematize this information flow, still recruit informants, still pay for intelligence, still maintain networks of agents across multiple kingdoms. But the organic networks persist independently, have persisted for centuries, will continue persisting because information has value, and humans are social creatures who share what they know. Dandelion's contribution was recognizing this, understanding that he was not creating an intelligence network, but rather becoming part of one that already existed, that his value lay not in establishing something new, but in connecting existing nodes more effectively. The songs he composed will eventually be forgotten. Cultural memory is limited. Even the most popular ballads fade when no one performs them anymore. But the networks, those will endure, will adapt to new technologies, new political arrangements, new threats and opportunities. Will continue moving information from those who have it to those who need it, through channels both formal and informal, for as long as humans organize themselves into societies that create hierarchies of power and knowledge. This was the real lesson of the Bard's Quiet War. Not that songs could change the world, though they could. Not that intelligence gathering was effective, though it was. But that information moves through human networks that pre-exist any individual's participation in them. That the most effective intelligence work recognizes and enhances these natural information flows rather than trying to replace them with artificial systems. Dandelion had learned this, had put it into practice during years when kingdoms hung in balance, had contributed to outcomes that would shape the continent for generations, and then had stepped back, let others continue the work, built something simpler and more honest in his later years, while the networks he had helped operate continued functioning without him. This was enough, more than enough.